The night I ran into the blizzard, I was not running toward anything. I was running from the moment my father told me I would belong to a stranger by spring, and something inside me that had been dying for years finally chose to live. My name is Elena, and for 19 winters I have been the silent daughter, the forgotten child, the girl who learned to move through rooms without making a sound. My mother died when I was 7, and with her went my father's laughter, his warmth, his recognition that I existed at all. He remarried a woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, and I became the shadow in my own home, useful only for the labor my hands could provide. I scrubbed floors until my knuckles bled. I carried water until my shoulders ached. I cooked and cleaned and mended. And in return, I received cold silence and colder looks. I remember the night everything changed with perfect clarity. The fire crackled in the hearth while my stepmother smiled at a man I had never seen before. He was thick-necked and older than my father, with hands that looked like they had broken things simply because they could. His small eyes moved over me like I was a horse at market, assessing my teeth, my hips, my capacity for work and bearing children. His name was Gregor, and he had come from the eastern village with an offer: timber rights in exchange for a bride. I understood then that I had never been a daughter. I had been currency, waiting to be spent. My father would not meet my eyes when I begged him. He stared into the fire and said nothing while my stepmother assured Gregor that I was healthy and strong and quiet, as if she were describing livestock. I pleaded with him to remember who I was, to remember the little girl who used to sit on his knee while he carved wooden animals by the fire. But that man was gone, buried with my mother in the frozen ground. The man who remained was hollow, empty, incapable of seeing past his own grief. That silence from my father broke something final in my chest. I had spent 12 years hoping he would remember how to love me. In that moment, I stopped hoping. I waited until the house grew still and the snow began to fall. I took my mother's old cloak from the chest where it had been forgotten, the green wool still carrying the faintest trace of her scent after all these years. I wrapped bread and dried meat in cloth and slipped out into the white darkness. The cold hit me like a living thing, sharp and hungry, but I did not turn back. Behind me was a life that had never wanted me. Ahead was the unknown, and the unknown at least held possibility. I walked for hours through the deepening snow. The forest loomed to my left, dark and forbidden, the place where the village children were taught never to venture. Old spirits lived there, my mother once told me when I was small, her voice soft with reverence rather than fear. They remember the old agreements. I did not know what she meant then. I did not know many things then. The blizzard grew teeth. The wind screamed through the trees and the snow fell so thick I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. My body began to fail me, the cold seeping past the cloak, past my skin, into my bones. I stumbled and fell, rose and stumbled again. The snow was past my knees now, each step a battle against the weight of winter itself. I knew I was dying, and some part of me whispered that perhaps this was better than what waited in Gregor's house. At least this death was my own choice. At least I would die free. That is when I saw it through the swirling white. A structure, angular and wrong against the organic shapes of the forest. I dragged myself toward it, my legs numb and distant, and found myself before an ancient train station, its wooden walls silvered by decades of weather. The platform was buried under drifts of snow, and icicles hung from the eaves like frozen tears. The tracks that once ran before it had long since been swallowed by earth and root. No trains had passed through here in generations. Perhaps no living soul had stood where I stood in just as long. I crawled inside through a gap where the door had rotted away. The interior was dark and cold, but the walls blocked the killing wind. Old benches lined the walls, their wood cracked and gray. A rusted stove sat in one corner, long dead, long cold. I collapsed against the far corner, my body shaking so violently I could hear my own teeth cracking against each other. I pulled my mother's cloak tighter, breathing in that fading scent of lavender and wool, and closed my eyes, certain I would not open them again. I thought of her then, my mother, and wondered if she would be waiting for me wherever I was going. I do not know how long I lay there suspended between life and death. Time lost all meaning in that frozen darkness, but I remember the exact moment I felt the warmth. It came slowly at first, a pressure against my back, a heat that seemed impossible in that frozen place. I thought I was dreaming, thought perhaps death felt like warmth before the final darkness. But then I heard breathing, deep and steady, and I forced my frozen eyelids open. He lay beside me, his massive body curved around mine, his white fur thick and warm against my trembling form. The wolf was enormous, larger than any I had seen in drawings or heard described in hunters' tales. His coat was the color of fresh snow, pure and luminous even in the darkness, but marked with scars, old wounds that had healed into pale lines across his muzzle and shoulders. His eyes, when they met mine, were amber and ancient, filled with an intelligence that made my breath catch in my throat. I should have been afraid. Every story I had ever heard told me this creature should have killed me, that wolves were monsters who devoured lost travelers and left only bones for the spring thaw to reveal. But there was no hunger in those amber eyes. There was recognition, as if he had been waiting for me, as if my arrival in this forgotten place was not chance but destiny written in the stars long before my birth. We lay there together through the long night, his warmth seeping into my frozen body, his steady breathing a rhythm that my own breath began to match. His fur was softer than I had imagined, thick and clean, smelling of pine and snow and something wild that I could not name. I slept, truly slept, for the first time in years, dreamless and deep, and when I woke, pale dawn light filtered through the gaps in the station walls. The wolf was watching me. He rose with fluid grace, his size even more striking in the light, and walked to the doorway. His paws left perfect prints in the frost that had formed on the floor. There he paused and looked back at me with those knowing eyes. The message was clear. Follow. I should not have trusted him. I know this. But something deeper than logic spoke in my blood, something that remembered what my mind had forgotten. I rose on unsteady legs, my muscles stiff and aching, and followed the white wolf into the snow-covered forest. He led me along paths that should not have existed, through gaps in the undergrowth that seemed to open just for us. The forest was silent around us, but not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of watching, of waiting. I felt eyes on me from the shadows between the trees, felt presences that were not quite animal and not quite spirit. The snow here was untouched by human feet, pristine and glittering in the morning light. We walked for what felt like hours until we reached a place where the trees opened into a small clearing. At its center stood a cave mouth, dark and deep, framed by stones that bore markings I did not recognize but somehow understood. They were old, these symbols, older than the village, older perhaps than human memory. The wolf entered without hesitation, and I followed him into the earth. The cave was warm, impossibly warm, as if the stone itself breathed heat. Light came from somewhere I could not identify, a soft glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from veins of crystal that ran through the rock like frozen lightning. And there, in the deepest chamber, I found her. She was a wolf like the alpha but smaller, her fur silver white, her eyes the same amber but softer, older, touched with a maternal gentleness that made my heart ache. She lay on a bed of dried moss and soft grasses, and around her were 3 cubs, their eyes barely open, their small bodies squirming with new life. The alpha went to her and touched his muzzle to hers with such tenderness that I felt tears burn my frozen cheeks. I had not seen such love in years, not since my mother last held my face in her hands and told me I was precious. But it was what lay beyond them that stole my breath entirely. The cave wall was covered in paintings, images made with pigments that still held their color after what must have been centuries. Women standing with wolves, hands pressed to stone in gestures of oath and promise, symbols that matched the ones I had seen at the cave entrance. And at the center of it all, a figure I recognized with a shock that nearly drove me to my knees. My mother. Not a painting of her, but her likeness captured so perfectly it could only have been made by someone who knew her face as well as I did. She stood with her hand on the head of a great white wolf, her eyes looking out from the stone with the same warmth I remembered from my childhood, the same gentle strength that had made me feel safe in a world that would later become so cold. I do not know how long I stood there, trembling, trying to understand what I was seeing. The Alpha came to stand beside me, his presence steady and patient. And slowly the truth began to unfold in my mind like a flower opening to sun. My mother had been a guardian, her mother before her, and her mother before that, stretching back through generations I could not count. They were the women who kept the old pact between the human world and the wild world, who ensured that the forest and its spirits were respected, who served as bridges between two realms that had grown ever further apart. When my mother died, the line should have continued through me. But I had been taken to the village, raised in ignorance by a father too broken to remember his wife's sacred duty, kept from the legacy that was my birthright. The wolves had been waiting. The forest had been waiting. And now, at last, I had found my way home. The days that followed were unlike anything I had known. The silver wolf, whom I came to call Luna in my mind, taught me without words, guiding me through the forest to places of power and memory. I learned to read the signs in the bark of trees, to hear the whispers in running water, to feel the pulse of life that connected every root and branch and creature. The Alpha, whom I named Frost for the white of his fur and the patience of winter, was my constant shadow, protective and watchful, never more than a few paces from my side. I learned that the forest was not empty, but full, teeming with life both visible and hidden. There were spirits in the oldest trees, ancient beings who had watched the world change through countless seasons. There were memories in the stones, echoes of every guardian who had walked these paths before me. There were ancestors whose bones had become the very earth I walked upon, their wisdom still accessible to those who knew how to listen. And at the center of it all was the pack, the wolves who had been guardians themselves for as long as the women of my line had walked these woods. They accepted me as one of their own, and in their acceptance I found something I had never truly had. Family, belonging, home. But even as I found peace in this new life, I knew it could not last. The human world does not forget its claims so easily, and wounded pride is the most dangerous predator of all. They came on the first day of true spring, when the snow had begun to melt and the streams ran swift with ice water. I heard them before I saw them, the crash of boots through underbrush, the shouts of men who had no respect for silence. I climbed to a ridge where I could see the valley below, and my heart turned to stone in my chest. There were a dozen of them, armed with bows and blades and the long spears used for killing wolves. At their head walked Gregor, his thick face red with cold and fury, his pride still burning from the humiliation of losing his purchased bride. Beside him was my father, and even from this distance I could see the defeat in his shoulders, the way he followed rather than led. My stepmother had sent them. She had decided that if she could not sell me, she would at least have revenge. They were hunting the wolves. They were hunting me. I ran back to the cave, my mind racing. The cubs were still too young to travel far, their legs unsteady, their eyes only recently opened to the world. Luna was weak from nursing, her body thin from the demands of new motherhood. We could not flee. We could only fight or hide, and against so many armed men, fighting seemed like choosing death. But Frost did not seem afraid. He met me at the cave entrance with those ancient amber eyes, and in them I saw something I had not expected. Trust. Faith in me that I had not yet learned to have in myself. He believed I could protect them. He believed I was the guardian I was born to be. I did not know if he was right, but I knew I would die before I let them harm my pack. I spent the day preparing. I used everything Luna and the forest had taught me, every secret path and hidden hollow, every trick of misdirection that the woods themselves seemed to offer. I laid false trails and covered true ones. I called upon the spirits of the trees, not knowing if they would answer, only knowing that I had to try. And they did answer, in their own way, the branches seeming to shift to hide our paths, the snow falling fresh to cover our tracks. When darkness fell, I went to meet the hunters alone. I found their camp at the edge of the deep woods, their fire a violation of orange light against the sacred dark. They had posted a guard, but he was watching for wolves, not for a woman who had learned to move like shadow. I crept close enough to hear their voices, close enough to smell the ale on their breath and the fear beneath their bravado. Gregor was speaking of the bounty he would collect, the glory of killing the white demon that had terrorized the region for generations. He spoke of me too, of the witch who had fled into the forest, of the unnatural hold I must have over the beasts. The other men laughed and agreed, their courage bolstered by drink and numbers. Only my father sat apart, silent, his face turned toward the darkness as if he could feel me watching. I made my choice. I stepped into the firelight, and the camp exploded into chaos. Men scrambled for weapons, curses filling the air, but I held up my hands and stood my ground. Gregor's face twisted with recognition and rage. But before he could speak, I spoke first. I told them the truth. I told them about the Guardians, about the pact that had protected this land for centuries, about the balance between human and wild that their hunt would destroy. I told them that the wolves were not demons but protectors, that the forest was not their enemy but their oldest ally. I told them that I was the last of my line, and that I would not let them break what my ancestors had died to preserve. Some of them listened. I could see doubt creeping into their eyes, old stories remembered from grandmother's knees, superstitions that suddenly seemed less foolish in the dark of the forbidden forest. But Gregor only laughed, a cruel sound without humor, and raised his spear. He never completed the throw. Frost came out of the darkness like a ghost, silent and terrible, and the other wolves came with him. Not attacking, not yet, but surrounding, their amber eyes reflecting the firelight like stars fall into earth, their presence undeniable. The men who had been so brave a moment before now trembled, their weapons shaking in their hands. This was no longer a hunt. This was a reckoning. I spoke again, and this time they listened. I told them to leave, to return to their villages and spread the word that the forest was protected, that the old pact still held. I told them that any who came to hunt would find only their own deaths waiting. I told them that I was the guardian now, and I would show no mercy to those who threatened my pack. One by one, they lowered their weapons. One by one, they backed away into the darkness, until only Gregor and my father remained. Gregor's face was purple with fury, his pride wounded beyond repair, but even he could see that he was beaten. He spat at my feet and turned away, crashing through the undergrowth like the graceless beast he was. My father lingered. For a long moment, we looked at each other across the dying fire, and I saw in his eyes something I had stopped hoping to find. Regret, recognition. The ghost of the man he had been before grief hollowed him out. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. In the end, he simply bowed his head and followed the others into the night. It was not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever. But it was a beginning. It was an acknowledgement that I was more than he had allowed himself to see. I stood in the darkness after they left, the wolves pressing close around me, and I let myself breathe. The danger had passed. The pack was safe. And I had become, at last, what I was always meant to be. Spring deepened into summer, and summer mellowed into autumn. And with each passing season, I grew more fully into my role. The cubs grew strong and swift, racing through the forest on legs that seemed to lengthen daily, their playful yips echoing through the trees. Luna recovered her strength and became my closest companion, a sister in spirit if not in blood. And Frost remained at my side, his presence a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. The villagers learned to leave offerings at the edge of the forest, small gifts of grain and honey and cloth, tokens of respect for the guardian who watched over the boundary between worlds. In return, the forest blessed their crops, protected their livestock, kept the harsh winters from claiming too many lives. The old balance was restored, the pact renewed by blood and choice and love. I never returned to the village that had been my prison. I never again saw my father or my stepmother or the man who had tried to buy me like cattle. My life was the forest now, the cave that had become my home, the wolves who had become my family. I had been lost, and I had been found. I had been frozen, and I had been warmed. I had been nothing, and I had become everything. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon hangs full and silver over the trees, I go to the old train station where my new life began. I sit in the corner where I almost died, and I remember the moment when a great white wolf chose to save a stranger rather than let her perish. I do not know why he did it. Perhaps he sensed the guardian's blood in my veins. Perhaps the forest itself guided him to me. Perhaps it was simply kindness, the same kindness that beats in every heart willing to recognize it. What I know is this: I was freezing, alone, abandoned by everyone who should have loved me. And he came out of the storm, this scarred and ancient creature, this legend made flesh, and he lay down beside me and shared his warmth until I remembered how to live. Our bond did become legend, though not in the way the old stories tell it. It became legend in the whispers of children who grow up knowing that the forest is sacred. It became legend in the offerings left at the boundary stones, in the howls that echo through winter nights, in the peace that is held between two worlds for all the years since that frozen night. It became legend not because it was written down or sung in halls, but because it was lived every day in the small acts of trust and protection that make any love real. I am Elena, the last guardian of the old pact, the woman who runs with wolves, the daughter of the forest who was once the forgotten daughter of a woodcutter. And this is my home now, this wild and sacred place, this realm of snow and stone and ancient memory. I will protect it until my last breath, and when I am gone, another will rise to take my place, just as I rose to take my mother's. The cycle continues, the forest remembers, and somewhere in the white woods, the alpha wolf still watches, his amber eyes full of the wisdom of ages, his scarred heart beating in rhythm with mine. This is how a girl becomes a legend. Not through glory or conquest, but through surviving the storm, through trusting the wild, through finally finding the place where she belongs.